That is the motto of the class, is more sin, please. There. I don't know if that, I'm trying to get it so I don't look quite so yellow, since there we are. I don't know. Sinning, I'm not sure what the right lighting is for sin, but nonetheless, today in our parade of the 7 deadly sins, we're doing pride. I remind you that despite the fact that the 7 deadly sins are an often used list, there's nothing particularly Jewish about this list, but it is a convenient list for us to go through various sins and see how Judaism sees them. And last time we did anger primarily because we live in a society, unfortunately, that has a lot of anger. But today we are doing pride. And in some ways, pride is I suppose you could say, the mother of all sins, in the same way that it has been said that if you look at the 10 Commandments, they all ultimately resolve to stealing. If you think about almost any one of the 10 Commandments, it's about taking something that doesn't belong to you. And stealing is in that way the root, in some ways, thinking that things are yours that ought not to be yours, or not giving someone else what is due to them. In the same way, pride is a kind of source of sin, because pride is what allows us sometimes to block out what it is we're doing and the effect on others of what we're doing, so that we don't feel the extent to which it is painful for them. Anyway, having started with that, I will now go through a couple of the mentions in the Torah of pride, so that we get a background that enables us to look at it in a few different dimensions, especially because it is in some ways the first sin. What goes before a fall? If you know that phrase, pride goes before a fall, because remember, Adam and Eve in the garden were tempted by the fruit because they were going to become godlike. That is what the serpent says. God doesn't want you to eat this because it will effectively enhance your powers beyond what God wants. And so pride is a kind of primal sin. And part of what is true of pride and true of every sin is that it is in part a function of degree. You need a certain amount of pride, obviously, in order to accomplish what you want to accomplish in the world, and yet pride is also a stumbling block. And humility can spill into pride. Like the old joke about a guy who's being honored in a dinner, and they talk about his achievements and this and that, and he gets up and says, "You forgot to mention my humility." That is, or the even older joke, one of the most venerable of Jewish jokes, about the 3 scholars on Yom Kippur who are beating their breasts and saying, "I'm nothing, I'm nothing, I'm nothing." And the humble ritual director in the back looks at them, and he figures this is what you're supposed to do. So he starts to beat his breast and say, "I'm nothing, I'm nothing." And one of the scholars nudges the other and says, "Psh, look who thinks he's nothing." So sometimes humility can spill over into pride, to be sure, but the sin of pride is a real one. And arrogance is a true offense, in part not because so much you think well of yourself as because it's almost always built on the backs of others. So there's Adam and Eve, who violate the one prohibition that they're given because of pride. There's the famous story of Icarus. Remember, Daedalus, his father, fashions him wings of wax and says, "Just don't fly too close to the sun." And Icarus does, and the wings melt, and he plunges into the sea. This idea that thinking too highly of yourself will result in your downfall. Again, pride goes before fall, is the Greek hubris, which is enacted again and again in Greek drama and Greek legend. That is the idea that you are greater than, that you are greater in your own mind than you are in reality, and that leads you, of course, to commit sins because you don't realize your own limitations, and in trying to exceed them, you are upended, as Icarus is upended. It is also perhaps, although there are other contenders for this, the sin of the Tower of Babel, because in Babel, the inhabitants want to build a tower that reaches the sky, and we will make ourselves a name. That's what it says explicitly, and it does sound again like what they want is to be greater than they were, and that God's striking them down, although again, you could use other reasons why God does that, is in part because of this sense of pride. You know the saying of Rabbi Simcha Bunim, who says in one pocket you should have the phrase, I am dust and ashes, afar ve'efer. In other words, I'm effectively nothing. And in the other pocket, you should have bishvili nivra ha'olam, for me the world was created. Thereby balancing off the two, that when you feel excessively prideful, you'll remember that you're nothing. And when you forget that you have the dignity of a human being, you look at, for me the world was created. Antigonus of Socho in Pirkei Avot, in Ethics of the Fathers, says, remember where you came from, where you're going, and before whom you are supposed to give an accounting. Where have you come from? He says, a fetid, that means stinking, drop. In other words, a drop of sperm. Where are you going? To rot in the grave. And before whom must you give accounting for your life? The King of Kings, in other words, God. And what he's teaching is that balance between knowing that the graves are full of indispensable people. When we talk about people who can't be replaced, apparently everybody can, since the world is still running and everybody who can't be replaced is gone, except for the ones who are still alive, and they'll be gone. And yet, there is a beauty and a dignity to feeling that certain people can't be replaced, because it's also true that everybody is a unique image of God. And so to be overly self-abnegating, to think of yourself as unimportant, as dust only, is also a kind of sin. And yet, we live in an age in which humility is less valued than previous ages. The public figures in politics, in sports, in most public arenas, in entertainment, who proclaim that they are the best and they are the greatest and there's nobody as good as they are, and their opponents are nothing and useless and stupid and jerks. In classical Jewish teachings, that is quite apparently the sin of gaiva, as this ga'ava, pride, and that we're not supposed to think of ourselves or of others in that way. Every human being is in God's image, and therefore part of the sin of pride is the devaluing of God's image in others, because it's very hard to be arrogant and think well of everyone around you. We are too comparative as creatures. And while it is true that in some ways it's unwise to compare yourself to others, comparison, as has been wisely said, is the thief of joy, right? You think you're in good shape until somebody else is in better shape, and then you feel bad. There's a wonderful fable from Aesop about that, about a guy who has a wish and he can get whatever he wants, but the person next to him will get twice as much. So first he wishes for money, the guy next to him has twice as much money. He wishes for a house, the guy next to him gets 2 houses. So finally, in frustration, he wishes to be blinded in one eye. The idea, obviously, is when we compare ourselves to others, sooner or later, we will be unhappy, because sooner or later, there will always be someone who has more of everything than we do. More skill, more health, more wealth, more brains, more whatever. And we live in a world in which the parading of whatever it is you have is a quality that people seek, and therefore is a prop to pride, which is constantly being increased just by the nature of the self-display, the incessant self-display, which is a feature of our programming these days on social media and YouTube. So anyway, the other part of this is, the Jewish tradition teaches mitzvah goreret mitzvah. When you do a mitzvah, it leads to another mitzvah. The same is true of aveirah. Aveirah goreret aveirah. That is, a sin leads to another sin. And pride and anger are not so distant one from the other. Anger, which we spoke about last time. Because if you think you are the best thing going, then when someone, for whatever reason, disagrees with you or takes issue with your idea that you're the best thing going, you're going to feel hurt by that. And it's going to impair your pride. And that is going to cause anger. So the two are both tied in. Obviously, they're ego sins, which I suppose most sins are. I don't know that all, but most sins are. And the two are tied together and therefore become a part of the same dynamic. You're prideful, and therefore you're angry, and therefore you are involved in all the sins that both pride and anger feel. Now, pride is an interesting sin in a certain sense, which is true of some but not all the sins, because it is internal and not always expressed. So the question is, if you just feel prideful but don't act on it, is that a sin? And as you know, and this is a question that we return to with several other sins, generally Judaism is action-oriented when it comes to sin, not emotion or cognition-oriented. Less about sins of thinking or feeling than about sins of doing. Now, I don't want to overstate this point, which people sometimes do, and say that there is no such thing as a sin of feeling or thinking in Judaism. There's only a sin of doing. That's not necessarily true. It depends which authority, which source you want to quote. There's enough in Judaism to support every position. And you could certainly support the position that there are sins that are about the way you think or the way you feel. But generally speaking, that is not the case. As we will see later on, when we come, for example, to lust, that the sins that you confess to on Yom Kippur are almost always sins of action, sins of speech, which is a kind of action, certainly. And pride, if it doesn't manifest itself in some negative action, in Judaism is not as severely thought of as you might think. However, is it still reckoned as something that one ought to avoid? Well, I'll give you the beautiful words of a rabbi. His name escapes me for the moment. I can look up the source, but he said, when I die and I go before God, and God says to me, why weren't you like Moses? I'll say, why didn't you devote yourself to the law like Moses did? I'll say, well, Moses was a great man. I wasn't a great man. I couldn't devote myself to the law like Moses. He'll say, well, why didn't you study like Rabbi Akiva? And he'll say, well, Rabbi Akiva was a great intellect. I was kind of lazy. I didn't have such a great intellect. I couldn't study like him. I couldn't be a master like him. It just wasn't in me. He'll say, so why didn't you do good deeds, mitzvot, like another, I don't know, who you want to pick as your exemplar of mitzvot? And he'll say, well, again, I was not as motivated. Perhaps I was a little bit selfish. He said, then God will say to me, so why were you prideful? And I won't have an answer. Self-criticism is sort of built into the system. We tend to think that self-criticism is inherently unhealthy and that you should have self-esteem and you shouldn't be so hard on yourself. And again, it is a question of balance, but certainly in the Jewish tradition, to be self-critical is not thought of necessarily as a bad thing. It all depends what you're critical of yourself for, and also the extent to which that enables you to understand not only who you are, but also to see the other. And seeing the other is I think, in some ways, to see the other is the critical factor, because seeing the other means that your take on the world is not solely through your own eyes. That empathy, which is in some ways, an antidote to pride, enables you to understand that you can be wrong, the way you see the world can be wrong, the way you express yourself about things can be wrong. And that's where we get to humility. Humility means that you appreciate the difference of others and their goodness, ability, so on, such that you are willing to entertain them as seriously as you do yourself. And again, this does not mean that you think that you are worthless, right? The Kotzker Rebbe has this beautiful comment that I've quoted before about why God gave the Torah on Sinai. Because after all, Sinai is a small mountain, says the Talmud. And God could have given it on Everest or Kilimanjaro, although that would have been quite a trip from Egypt. But nonetheless, the Talmud says the reason God gave the Torah on Sinai is Sinai is a small mountain, and God was teaching humility, that even a small mountain can be the site of the giving of the Torah. So the Kotzker Rebbe asked a very good question. If that's true, why didn't God give the Torah in a valley? If you're going to teach humility, so teach humility. And his answer is that it's not really humility if you think you're a valley. It's only humility if you understand that you're a mountain and you're still humble. In other words, humility doesn't mean that you actually think you have no gifts. It means that you understand that you have certain gifts, and yet you are broad enough and deep enough to understand that those gifts have limitations, that they have they are not universal, they're not greater than anyone else's gifts all the time, and that Ezehu Chacham, who is wise, halomei mikol adam, someone who learns from everyone, which is a counsel of humility. You are not the only one to teach, you also have to be able to learn. And so there is a bearing, a way of being in the world that you feel from certain people whose humility feels genuine. And what you get from them is that they know that they are fragile and fleeting creatures, and that it is, in some sense, a sin to assume that they're the center of the universe. And it's the Ozymandias sin. You remember Shelley's poem Ozymandias about traveling in the desert, and he comes upon this giant piece of stone that says, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." And then he says, as he looks around, the lone and level sands stretched far away. In other words, Ozymandias built this gigantic edifice to himself, and now all that's left is the stone that says, "Look at my edifice," but it's gone. And Ozymandias is just one in a long line of egomaniacal people who think that their legacy will last forever and ever. And in fact, it is interesting to think that those leaders that we think of in America as our greatest presidents were distinguished in part by the humility of their bearing. Lincoln was famous for it, even though he was bold and self-confident and brilliant. He also had a humility of bearing that people often commented on. And remember Washington, there was a serious move to make him king, or at least to keep him in perpetuity as president. But he left. He said, "No, I'm done," and went back to his farm, like Cincinnatus of ancient Rome. And that combination of ability and humility, certainly in our history, has been something that was powerful in American history and most powerful in Jewish history. Because the only description really of Moses's character is anav meod mikol adam, that he was more humble than anyone else on earth. Now think about that, right? Here's Moses, chosen by God, the most important leader in human history, the person who brings this people out of slavery and into freedom, who is God's representative on earth and gives them the Torah. And what is the only thing? It doesn't even say Moses was the nicest man who ever lived. Moses was the best man who ever lived. Moses did more good deed. No, he was the most humble. Which is not because Moses did not have self-confidence. Not because Moses did not eventually fashion himself into a leader who believed he should lead, but because Moses had some glimpse of God and therefore understood his own finitude, his own smallness, his own unworthiness before what is infinitely greater than himself. And so I imagine when Moses saw Israelites being prideful or arrogant, it must have struck him as absurd, having seen what he had seen and knowing what he knew. The beautiful way that C.S. Lewis puts it, and one of the best comments about humility is from Lewis. He said, "Humility is not thinking less of yourself. Humility is thinking of yourself less," which gives us an insight into what pride is. Pride is making yourself the center of your concerns, always. And therefore, other people's concerns shrink and vanish into virtual nothingness because you are what matter and your concerns are what count and not other people's. And this is also part of the complex of pride that also extends beyond people's personal pride to that which is a part of them. So their family is the best family, and their country is the best country. And you could go on and on and on with this. I don't know how many people are convinced all over the world that whatever country they're born into is really the best country in the world. Whatever religion they're born into is the best religion in the world. And it extends to virtually everything, whatever university they went to, whatever, so on and so forth. And that insistence on pride, on the essential mistakenness of others, on the certainty of our own certainty, this is a deeply human trait, and one, like all things listed in these 7 sins, one that has to be combated constantly, because we tend to denigrate other people subtly and overtly in order that we can ourselves feel good about our own choices and even our own mistakes. We don't want the doubt that we should have done it this way to come back and haunt us when we recognize that, in fact, there were other ways to do it that were as legitimate and might have been even better. Okay, so that is a good, half hour or so on pride and humility. And I am certainly open to any questions that you can put into the chat, or I don't know if there are any on the Facebook or YouTube, but I will, along with you, take a look. And I am happy to respond to them if there are. Okay, whoops, there we go, okay. Good afternoon to all of you, and I'm glad you like listening. Do you have a question? If so, please be sure to let me know. I saw that someone that you have an alternative story about the, instead of being blinded in one eye, you asked to be beaten half dead, which could also work. That humility is thinking of others first and making their need priorities over my own. I think that that's certainly a way of thinking about humility, Moira, and it reminds us that the ability to see others as real, which is not an easy thing to do, to acknowledge that others actually have needs equal to our own, is a level of maturity and awareness that is very difficult to achieve for many people. And for other people, equally difficult is to believe that their own needs matter as much as other people's do. And that balance is, as I say, a very difficult one to strike. But I wouldn't even say it's a difficult one to strike. It is a lifelong balance to strive for, because in each situation and in each circumstance, you have to decide, does this person's needs take precedence over my own? I asked the question the other day on Twitter. How obligated are you to respond to an unsolicited email? It's a real question. It may not be a question if you get infrequent emails, but if you get deluged with emails, as almost anyone does who has any kind of public profile, people will write you all the time. So to what extent are you obligated to respond to them? If your obligation is complete, that means you will spend all day and all night responding to emails, or Facebook messages, or messages on whatever platforms you're on, responding to messages. Let's put it more broadly and generally. On the other hand, if you just don't bother to answer people, you're not very nice. And also, there's obviously a tremendous variation in content. Somebody writes you a nasty email, you're not obligated to write back something sweet and forgiving, or at all. But what if somebody writes you a serious, thoughtful inquiry, or something about their own life, or hard to decide at what point do your needs and other people's needs, even in this trivial example, at what point do they intersect? And At what point does your centrality to yourself get to overcome someone else's desire to hear from you? I don't have an answer. I was curious. I took as I said, I took that poll on Twitter. I think 58% said that you're under no obligation. Some 30-some% said it depends on the content, and then a very small percentage, like 6 or 7%, said that you absolutely have to. But yeah, it is difficult, as Mindy says, and that's true, I think, of most ethical dilemmas, because as my brother, who is a professional ethicist, he's the head of the Bioethics Center in Atlanta at Emory University, and he's a professor of bioethics there. As he often says in his lectures and talks, ethical dilemmas are almost never between what is right and what is wrong. They're between competing rights. And you have to decide which trumps them, which wins in the two. It's very hard to decide, in a lot of cases, which is the more compelling response. Yeah, you hope that from life you learn and you grow. And nonetheless, the battle of pride and humility is a constant one. Some of the sins that are mentioned here, some of them, some people, I think, basically, they're not all necessarily lifelong struggles for everyone. Sloth or greed or gluttony, all of which we will talk about. I think there are people for whom that's not a lifelong struggle, but those that are most tied to ego, those that are, how do I respond to situations? How important am I and how important are others? I don't think those ever entirely go away for most of us, even up to the end of our lives. When we have to, because the one, not because, but the one finite resource that we do have, of course, is time. And the extent to which we spend that on others or ourselves, you know? And yeah, I do see Moira's point about that you try to respond with love to someone, and if you've antagonized someone, you apologize. I think that diffusing tactic often works. Although it is also true that certain messages seem antagonistic enough that it is sometimes difficult not to respond with at least some measure of sharpness. But if you can, more power to you. That requires a certain ego strength. Well, how do you reverse the pride or ego action once done? I suppose it depends in part what it is, and also, at least I think that if you approach somebody who you've wronged with genuine humility, most people will feel it, and if they don't, then you can feel yourself acquitted. And what Brendan asks about, can you choose to be humble or must you learn to be humble? I think you can choose to learn to be humble. I'll take both sides. That is, I don't think you can snap your fingers and be humble. I think that you can do certain things like remind yourself. And in the morning prayers, when you say, Ma anachnu ma chayenu, ma tzidkenu, what are we? What is our life? What is our goodness? If you remind yourself each day that the world, that you have to strike a balance between what the world does for you and what you do for the world, that most of what you have, you were given. Overwhelmingly, most of what you have, you were given. And also, I think one of the things that helps is if you remind yourself that when people act antagonistically towards you, almost all the time, it actually has much, much less to do with you than it does with them. Because generally people react out of their own personality structure and not because they really understand and have taken in what you've said or done. So if somebody is unkind and you have to respond, if you can, respond kindly. If you can, try. And of course here, which is moving into slightly different territory, the most valuable thing is to wait. Instantaneous responses are almost never your best responses to an unkind message, right? The old wisdom of counting to 10 is really smart, except that you should probably count higher than 10. So when someone is mean, it's generally out of their own insecurity, anger, ego, or because you've inadvertently triggered something in them that you're not aware of. And you see this all the time. And very often, if you respond undefensively, you will disarm the person and change them. Not always, not always. Everybody has gotten mean messages from people who are just going to send you mean messages. But it is possible to make people a little bit less angry if you respond unangrily, which takes work. It takes work, and it takes strength, and it takes a deep breath and a certain calm. But it's a really, really good discipline to learn, especially in a society where ratcheting up anger is a constant danger and a constant enterprise. So there you go. And with that, I don't want to tell you that I'm proud of this class, because that would be violating the sin that I'm talking about. But I have enjoyed it. I hope you have. I think we're going to do envy next. And again, pride and envy, closely related. And envy, just as a teaser for the next class, envy is really important in some ways because envy can be motivating. So how do you disentangle motivating envy from destructive envy? I don't know, but I'll know by next month. Thank you for joining. Bye, everyone.